Wonderful. So we'll begin. Welcome, everyone. My name is Natalie Nudell. I'm a member of the Fashion Studies Alliance, and welcome to our series, Getting to Know. We are getting to know Dr. Maude Bass-Krueger and Dr. Sophie Kurkdjian, two wonderful fashion historians based in Europe. Dr. Maude Bass-Krueger is in Ghent, Belgium, joining us from Belgium, and Sophie Kurkdjian is joining us from Paris. Thank you both for joining us and participating today. We're so grateful to be able to really expose all of your research and get to know you more closely. I'll begin with asking our three main questions to both of you, and then we'll get into your collaborative work together. So we could start with Maude, since she is in my full screen now. What is your training and education?
Hi, everybody. It's lovely to see that you're participating and see some of your faces. So I did my undergraduate in history. I'm American, but I grew up half in the US and half in France. So my studies were also divided between the two. I did my undergraduate in history at Wesleyan University. Junior year in Paris at Sciences Po, went back to Sciences Po for my master's in history. So Sophie and I both have history training, actually. And after my master's at Sciences Po in history, I went back to the US for my PhD at the Bard Graduate Center. So a PhD in decorative arts, design history, and material culture. Then a postdoc in Tel Aviv, another postdoc at Leiden, and this job now as assistant professor at Ghent. So I, throughout my studies, always focused and studied on fashion, but did it really from the perspective of a history department. And now I find myself in our art history department, actually, at Ghent, which has also been an interesting transition from a historian to an art historian.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that you're currently a professor in the Department of Art History, Musicology, and Theater Studies at the University of Ghent in Belgium. How did you get here? How did you fall into fashion?
Ooh, I grew up in Paris across from the Bon Marché, so I think that helped a lot. I would spend hours looking at people outside of my window. My father is a journalist, and he actually had a big project working on fashion when I was about 11 years old, and he took me to Lesage, to the Lesage archives when I was 12. And I think it was at that moment when I realized that fashion, that there were archives. I mean, I have very vivid memories of just being incredibly bowled over by the wealth of the archives at Lesage, and realizing that, any area of study that has a wealth of archives has something that's of interest to look at. So yeah, from the time I was 12, I realized that I wanted to be a fashion historian, and then that's what I've done since then.
That's wonderful. I'm sure those archives at Lesage were mind-blowing.
Yeah, and it was when Lesage was in its form. It's now moved, but it was in its original location. And
wonderful. So is there any part of your career or experience that was particularly impactful or motivating after that initial Lesage archive experience?
I mean, there are several. When I was really young in high school, I wrote a really impassioned letter to Harold Coda. I wanted to be an intern at the Costume Institute, and he actually accepted me as a really young high schooler. So that was another kind of stepping stone. And the other side, right? So I realized that I could be a historian, and then at a very young age, I also realized that the world of exhibition and museums could also be part of of my life. And then I have to say that my PhD at the Bard Graduate Center, because I'm a historian, I was so, I studied images and texts, and objects are not really part of a traditional historian's training, particularly in France. And I knew that I wanted to study objects and look at things. And so I very specifically chose the Bard Graduate Center in order to get a good training in the object. And I did. And I think that, one of the best decisions I ever made was going to the Bard Graduate Center as a PhD student. So I would say those are 3 formative moments: Lesage Archives, Harold Coda taking me on as like a young teen, and then the attending the Bard Graduate Center as a PhD student.
Wow, those all 3 sound so thrilling, and I'm sure Harold Coda was so enthused by having a teenager, essentially send a fan letter.
He put me in the basement to sort the mannequins. He didn't see very much of me.
But that's what an amazing start, right? Especially to start learning how museums work. Thank you so much. I'm going to switch now to Sophie, and then we'll get into your collaborative work. Sophie, welcome.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. So Dr. Sophie Kurkdjian is associated researcher with Institut d'Histoire du Temps Présent, or Institute for the History of Present Times, based in Paris, and is the director of Kncho the Mod, which is a network of fashion studies scholars primarily in France. So Sophie, what is your training and education?
Yes, so my training, in fact, I am an historian, and I started with my master, and I was studying cultural history, and I was interested in cultural history, and more specifically in media history. And I started to work on fashion press, and then I continued and did my PhD still in cultural history, and still on fashion press, and then fashion press to fashion illustration to the industry of fashion. So it was, yes, my master and PhD in cultural history. Then, I became a doctor in Histoire and a research associate to the IHTP CNRS.
Wonderful. And how did you speak about how in your master's you started looking at French magazines, fashion magazines. What led you to focusing on magazines?
In fact, it's because I was very interested in meeting, people who made fashion journals or magazines during the 50s, maybe 40s, 30s. So my first interest was to meet people and to make oral archives. And so I met, the daughter of Michel de Bruneuf, who was the director of French Vogue from 1929 to 1954. And, I just met her, and she explained me that her family was involved in French Vogue, in Jardin des Modes, in La Gazette du Bon Ton. And I remember, I met this woman, she was 18 years old. It was maybe 8 years ago. And just I discovered that I wanted to know more about this history of press, of men involved in the press, and how these people have contributed to change our way of consuming, of reading, of understanding the events around us. And so, I was interested in the making of magazines, because it's not like today. It was more complicated, and it involved a lot of people. It was a teamwork with photographs, illustrators, publishers. And so it was how I, jumped into this field of fashion magazines.
Wonderful, thank you. And is there any part of your career or experience that was particularly impactful or motivating, maybe aside from meeting the descendant of the Vogue, Paris Vogue editor?
That's true that the archives have always been like what I wanted to do, to dig into the archives, to work on it. And I really like the archives-based work. It's really my thing. And you know, after my PhD, it was complicated to know what to do, because in France and maybe everywhere, it's hard to find a full-time job of a teacher, of researcher. So I tried many things, and I'd worked during 2 years at the Fédération de la Haute Couture et de la Mode, so the French fashion syndicate created in 1868. And I worked. It was fascinating to work into the archives, but, you know, staying behind a computer and it was not enough. I wanted to really do research. So it was an important experience, I think, because I really understood that it was not enough, that I wanted to write, to publish articles, to make conferences, to meet researchers, and not only to, you know, classify or make inventories of archives. So this was an experience, because it, you know, it was like, after that I say that I wanted really to teach and do research, maybe more than teaching. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And both of your stories and sort of experiences ultimately combined in your collaborative exhibition, which you co-created, named French Fashion Women in the First World War, which was first at the Fournet Library in 2017 in Paris, and then traveled to the Bard Graduate Center Gallery last fall in 2019 in New York City, which was truly an exceptional exhibition. You know, rave reviews in the New York Times and so many other outlets. It was I attended it, and I thought numerous times, and I thought it was fantastic. And I'll ask you guys a few questions about it now, and at the same time, I'll share some images from the exhibition. So Maude, what were the 2 or 3 main key ideas of the exhibition?
Let me take a deep breath before I synthesize. So at its core, the exhibition seeks to understand the major changes that occur in the fashion textile industry and for women's lives between 1914 and 1918. So the exhibition opens with, you know, the last roll of photos that the Ciberger frères developed before the war began, and then the first roll that they developed in the post-war period. And the changes in the fashions are dramatic. And I think if you scroll down to the exhibition shot, then we can see these 4 photographs. So what happens? What happens to the industry in these 4 years? How does it have to adapt and change to the war? How do the fashion designers adapt and change? And more particularly, what can clothing tell us about women's lives? And I think that the key takeaways is that fashion was in 1914 and still is today in France, France's second largest industry. It's an industry of incredible importance, economic importance, social importance, cultural importance. And the French government and the French society were adamant in maintaining the health of the fashion industry for the entire duration of the war. So there's a general sense that the fashion industry is incredibly important, and even more so during the war. There's also a sense that women, sorry, my child just woke up at the same time, but luckily I have an in-house babysitter. My partner, not an actual babysitter, sorry, just to clarify.
We appreciate his important work.
Yes, lest you think that I'm breaking confinement, no. But yes, sorry, that took my mind off of something. Okay, so for the women, yeah, sorry, now I have to refocus.
No problem. I'll ask Sophie the second question, and we could come back to you.
Yes, ask her a question so I can refocus on work and not childcare.
Yes, so it was important to show that the French fashion industry was, has never stopped producing and disseminating fashion. and especially that French fashion was very important economically speaking and wanted to stay very important. And she has to fight against, you know, the American competition, the German competition. So this point was very important in the exhibition, and we focused on this, you know, imperatif économique, and on this, you know, we need to save the couture to win the war. And, you know, the economic imperative was really linked to the idea of national duty and effort patriotique to support the country. So it was something very important in the exhibition. Secondly, we also, we didn't want to talk only about the haute couture, the high society. It was very important for us to talk about, you know, people from the working class, and because most of the women had to replace men who left for the front. So we were interested in these women who were from, you know, lower class and who had to work for the first time instead to replace the man. So we studied, as you can see, how they look like, and we discussed the idea of uniforms that they have to wear, uniform that they can't find, and we try to study the figure of the nurse, the other workers, like this woman who was a driver, women who work for bus station, train station. So, you know, very new jobs for those women. So it was a way to talk about also the social work duty of women, and especially on the strike. You know, just the previous photo you saw, it's how women were involved in the country and how they went on the streets to ask for more money, to ask for better recognition of what they were doing. So we were very interested in this woman aspect, in this gender question, in this question of the woman emancipation. And it was maybe, the most important ideas of the exhibition.
Wonderful, thank you. And maybe I'll come back to, I'll ask you, Sophie, what kind of archives did you both use? Both of you could chime in on this one. What kind of archives did you focus on?
So it was really, we tried to use a lot of archives, and not only dresses and clothes. We really wanted to cross different kind of archives from different kind of institutions, private ones, public ones. So what was on display was photographs, postcards, posters, a lot of magazines, a lot of catalogues commerciaux, of course, a lot of clothes. And amongst our main lenders, we had French museums like Le Palais Galliera, like the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, a lot of libraries also, because in Paris we have really wonderful libraries with a lot of magazines and photographs. And for the New York exhibition, we were very lucky, because we had the possibility to have loans from the Met and from the FIT, and really we didn't have that in Paris. And it changed everything, because it's the same exhibition, and at the same time it's not the same at all, because we had more clothes, more uniforms, as you can see here, more dresses from the middle class, more dresses from, we found a wonderful dress at the Met, a dress who was presented during the 1915 San Francisco exhibition. And it was very nice, because we had the photo in Paris, we have the reproduction in the press, and thanks to the Met, we had the possibility to find the dress and to put everything in a vitrine, I don't remember, a case. And it was wonderful to cross the document. So really, it was a lot of different kind of archives, and from different kind of institutions, public and private. And cherry on the cake, we had the possibility to have documents from Chanel and Lanvin. So for us, it was, we had the first document that Chanel has today. It's a hat and a blouse from 1917. This is the first documents that Chanel has kept. So it was a first for us, and a first for an exhibition to have this kind of documents. And Lanvin was created at the end of the 19th century, and which have a lot of amazing archives. And it was really nice to have these documents during the two exhibitions.
Wonderful, thank you. And you spoke a little bit towards my next question, and I'll direct this one
Oh,
to
sorry.
Maude. No, absolutely no. It's a great lead-in into the exhibition, like you're saying, really sort of had two very distinctive iterations. Obviously, you guys are focusing on the same topic, but how is it different in Paris than in New York?
It's interesting. I mean, there are two very different kinds of institutions. So one's a public French city institution, and the other is the Bard Graduate Center, where money is not an issue, and where the BGC Gallery is a research-led gallery. So there are possibilities to present in ways that are really quite exceptional. So content-wise, there is no change. I mean, this exhibition is the fruit of 12, 13 years of research, and the narrative that we were telling in both countries was the same. There was more of an emphasis on women and women's place, I think, in New York, because of the specificities of what American audiences are interested in, and kind of a focus on female emancipation that our New York exhibition team wanted to bring forward. And I have to say that, as Sophie said, we were able to get more garment loans in New York than we actually were in Paris. Some Parisian institutions would not loan to us in Paris, but did want to loan to New York, paradoxically. So the exhibition was actually much richer in terms of garments and fashion in New York. And then we had, the benefit of having FIT at hand as well. So there was a slight change on emphasis in New York. There were more garments in New York, but the core narrative really remained the same.
Great, thank you for that. And now we'll talk about the associated publication that was published by Yale University Press for this exhibition. I'm going to take off my screen share because I know that Maude has the PDF, which she will share with all of us. So I'll start with the question for Sophie. Can you describe the book, which is both an exhibition catalog, meaning a list of all items on display during the exhibition, and a book with new content and new chapters?
Yes, thank you. It was a challenge because, it's an exhibition, so we have the possibility to make an exhibition catalog with, the list of all the items that were on display during the exhibition and all the text which were at the exhibition. But at the same time, since there was no book on World War I and fashion, we really wanted to publish articles, chapters with new content. We wanted to propose people to contribute to the book. So we also wanted to make a book, like a book with text, new text, and, really archives-based articles, really real research, if I may. So it was the challenge to find a balance between exhibition catalog and a book. So the result is what you can see here. We had the opportunity to work with a very smart designer who managed to do that, to present as much as text as, I don't know if my English is good, as images. So we really managed to, present all the documents that are on the exhibition, a timeline, a bibliography, a list of items, and also chapters with a lot of illustration, but also, as we say, a lot of footnotes and where we mention our sources, our archives. So it's what you can see here. It's a very dense, but it's how we try to have this two dimension in the book.
It's absolutely beautiful. And I know that Irma Boone is really a world-renowned book designer. So I'll ask Maude, what can you tell us a little bit more about the book's design? What was it like? Did you have any collaboration with Irma Boone, and how did that work?
Yeah, so I mean, the BGC is a wonderful institution, and what you want, you get. So I've been a fan of Irma's for a very long time. She works closely with Nina Strichter-Levine, who's the director of exhibitions at the Bard Graduate Center. And when Nina asked us who we were thinking of for a book, you know, I immediately said, oh, I mean, having Irma would be the dream. And Nina said, oh, well, you know, that's possible, and she would like to do this. I, at the time, was finishing up a postdoc and living in The Hague, and Irma lives in Amsterdam. And that's about a 40-minute commute between the two. And so Nina sent me up to Amsterdam to meet with Irma, and we got along really well. And we began to collaborate on making this book. So the Irma process is that nothing happens for a while, and then everything happens really quickly. So I had a first meeting with her, and we went through the books in her office, and she asked me what I liked and what I didn't like, and what this book was going to be about, whether it was a fashion book or a history book, an academic book, and she had very specific ideas about book size, and about how large the images should be. So it was important, or I think what drove Irma is the fact that our images weren't beautiful. She kept saying this: your images aren't beautiful. And they aren't, you know, they're not high fashion images. They are ephemera. They're, you know, the images of daily life during the war. They're not beautiful images. And so she felt that what this kind of image needed was to be brought forward and to have a full page. She had done a book with a museum in the Netherlands, likewise with a whole bunch of disparate, not very beautiful objects. And she had kind of done the same thing with that book, is to give each object its own large image. And that's kind of a first driving force for her, that each image needed to have its own page. And that kind of determined the trim size of the book as well. I love her Sheila Hicks book, and I told her that. And so she said that she would think about using that kind of format, the Hicks kind of smaller, thicker format. So then we write up the text, and you know, the exhibition is only a few months away, and she hasn't really presented a design to us. And all of a sudden we get an email with this design. And, you know, Nina writes to us and says, you know, be careful, you're about to get something. It's Irma, let me know what you think. And we open up the documents, and we see that she has proposed a text without paragraphs. She had just come back from a fellowship at the Vatican, in the archives of the Vatican, where she was able to look at old manuscripts, pre-printed manuscripts, and she had seen that before the printing press, there were no paragraphs, and you know, scribes used a defined line. And she thought that was just really interesting graphically, and it's something that she wanted to work with. And so she presented us with text without paragraphs, but where the paragraph spaces had a defined spacing. And it looked weird. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. The fact of the matter is, I trust Irma, and so we said yes to this design, which was really quite radical. And it's interesting, I love reading the comments on Amazon and online about what people think of this book design. And, you know, everyone says that it's odd, that it's hard to get used to, but once you get used to it, it's okay. And I think it's true. You do have to get used to it. But there were things that, I mean, and Irma, she creates books artisanally. I mean, so
Mhm.
we sat together and she kind of handcrafted this book. And so we like hand put all these figure numbers to make sure that the lines were breaking evenly, and I mean, so even like, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but even on the
Mhm.
right-hand side, you'll see how the words go in and out like this. We did that by hand. So, I mean, she made this book for us. It was incredible and an incredible process to watch. And I have to say, in between making this book with Irma and having the brilliance of the editing on the Bard Graduate Center, I really felt like we had an incredibly privileged team and situation. And it was a great honor, yeah, to see a book come together like that. So,
Absolutely. And, you know, by one of the foremost book designers in the world, right? What she's, like you said, she's pushing the boundaries.
Say, we were working, it was a female team, you know, it was Irma, Nina, Sophie and I, and most of the people who were working on this exhibit were women, and it was like this powerhouse team of women who were coming together to make this beautiful book and a gorgeous exhibit. And it felt really powerful. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that. Often work experiences don't go that way.
And an exhibit about women where yeah, okay.
Absolutely. No, I completely, it's an amazing experience. It's wonderful to hear that both of you experience such a rich collaboration, both together, but then also through Bard, through your, through the book design, etc. I will move on to the, once Maude, you're done sharing your screen, I will share, or maybe I could do it.
Okay. I stopped.
Okay, great. So I will share you both the most recent issue of French Historical Studies, which is the one of the foremost journals on French history that is published, I'm assuming quarterly or biannually, dedicated an issue to French fashion. It is the April 2020 issue. And I know both of you, including Stephen Znatny, were invited to edit. So for Sophie, what was the idea at the origin of the issue of French Historical Studies, which we will link it at the end of the talk. It is available for purchase online.
Yes, in fact, at the beginning, it's Stephen Znatny who proposed us to publish this issue. In fact, it was the French Historical Studies has already published articles from Marilyn Stewart and Nancy Troy on fashion, but it was not really, it's not their specialty, if I can say. But the idea was, why not? It's interesting, of course, to study fashion, and it's also to publish a special issue on fashion. It's also a way to not legitimate, but maybe yes, legitimate this field of study, especially in France and for French history, since you know, fashion is very important on the economic level. In France, she has fashion is also very important on in terms of heritage, archive, history, but fashion is not really studied at university. It's not a discipline, it's not a field. You can't teach fashion as a researcher with a permanent contract. So fashion is not yet a legitimate object of study. So, you know, when Stephen proposed us that, it was also a way to say, oh yeah, it's a very beautiful opportunity to give some importance to the field, to say, yes, we can have we have amazing scholars who study fashion and who can publish wonderful articles. So it was really, you know, it was not only that, this idea of legitimate field, but it was very important when we decided to do that. It was very, very important. And what was also important, it was to cover, not to talk about only the contemporary period. It was important to talk about the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the 17th century, 18th century. So, to say that fashion is not at all a contemporary issue, it's more than that. So that's why in this book you can find articles on French fashion from the Middle Age to the 20th century. So
and
it was.
Are all the articles in English?
The articles are. This is a bit in French and in English. Sorry. Yes,
Wonderful.
The idea was because it's so it's peer reviewed and it's not easy for a French scholar to write in English, even if he's a good scholar. So we had the possibility to publish both in English and in French.
Wonderful. And Maude, how did you both select the authors and the topics that you wanted to include in the special issue?
There was a call for papers, so we received many submissions after our call for papers went out, and then we had a reading committee. So Sophie, Stephen, the editor of the journal K, and I sat and we talked about the articles that we thought were good to be published. We also thought about chronology. So you'll see that it goes from the Middle Ages until the 19th century. And we were also really adamant about including a range of kind of disciplines. So the thing with fashion studies, which I think is so interesting, is that we come from diverse fields. We come from within history, from within sociology, from within art history, from within fashion studies. There are people who look at, objects. There are people who are more interested in literature and texts. And we really wanted to showcase the range of scholarship being done at the moment. And so we were also not only looking to make sure that we had a good chronological time frame, but also a really good disciplinary panel. So yeah, and then then you send it out for peer review, and peer review is really interesting as well. This is the first time I had been on the other end of peer review. It's brutal. I didn't realize how brutal people were, and now I feel even more terrified when I send my articles out because whoa. But what was also kind of incredible being an editor of this issue is that we could disagree with what the peer reviewers thought. And there were some articles that we included where the peer reviewers were really unkind and from a disciplinary standpoint. And I think that was also interesting to see, was that if you're sending, I want to be as vague as possible. But if you're sending something written from, like, let's say a literature perspective to somebody who deals in objects, that person is going to be really upset that this is all, text-based, and they're not going to suggest that this article is fit for publication. And we didn't feel that way. We felt that, that article might be very valid within its own field. And so that was also interesting to see, is that as editors, we had flexibility to say, okay, we've seen this review, we understand the issues, but we also feel that this article is interesting for publication. Yeah, so it was a really fascinating experience. And I think we published some really great articles, and I think we're really proud of the fact that we published from a variety of disciplines.
Wonderful, thank you. I look forward to reading it, and that is a very interesting experience, right? Negotiating all of these different scholars from different disciplines sort of interacting with each other, and fashion studies is so interdisciplinary that you're sort of assessing all of it together at one time. Lastly, before I let you guys go, I wanted to talk about Kncho the Mod, which is this, I'll ask you, what is Kncho the Mod and why did you create it?
Yes, so what is Culture de Mode? It's a network of scholars, professionals involved in fashion. In fact, you know, all the experiences we have with exhibition, with books. We also had a seminar on fashion history in Paris. We had with Maude since 2014. So we tried to develop different kind of project on fashion, and really with the idea to legitimate this field in the academy. And you know what we really realized is that fashion was studied, in fact, in France. We are talking about France, but it was, you know, some people were studying that in Paris, other in Lyon, but it was, you know, some people try to do research, but it's not easy when you're a teacher in you know the field. So we realized that it was maybe a good idea to have a network to gather people and to show that in France we have very good scholar, we can publish, we can have a critical view on fashion. So we discussed with the Ministry of Cultural Affairs in France, and you know, the minister was very involved in design, in all these spectacles, theaters, but not really in fashion, and they wanted to do something. So we discussed with them about this idea of developing a network, and with always this idea of sharing knowledge and sharing our skills, our ideas, and with the idea that we are stronger together, and that it's so important to have this interdisciplinary approach, but also this to have different kind of institution involved. So we have universities involved in the Culture de Mode. We have museums like Galliera and the MAD. We have Balenciaga for, you know, to have a brand in the steering committee. We have designers. We have real scholars like, you know, teacher, researcher, and also professionals. So it was really our point of view, transdisciplinaire and interinstitutionnel. And so the Ministère de la Culture gave us financial help, to develop the network. So it means that now we have a website, you know, which propose a timeline, soon a bibliography, podcast, and with the idea of gathering knowledge on fashion. Each month we propose workshops, you know, because it's working with membership. People register, became members, and then can access to workshops, and really new workshops like we are going to see Le Sage, for example, or we are going to see this kind of professional who normally doesn't open his door to the public. And a third dimension that we try to develop, it's really to develop a research project. So not with the public, but really between scholars and professionals.
Wonderful, thank you. And so you sort of answered my last question about who is also involved, which is great. And what a wonderful group and network to, you know, throughout our conversation, both of you have been sort of speaking about the lack of sort of cohesion or centralization of the discipline, or even, you know, Sophie, you were saying that it isn't really even a discipline per se. And so hopefully networks like Culture de Mode and like Fashion Studies Alliance that we're doing will help move that discussion forward. Before I let you guys go, because it's 11:45 and I know that everybody has a very busy day, I wanted to ask both of you, just by virtue of the research you've done, so much of your work has been about fashion in World War I. And we know that during World War I, we saw the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. And I wanted to ask both of you, what did you come across anything interesting, or how is it thinking about what our present day, what's going on right now, through the sort of filter of all the research you've done about a pandemic in a past time?
Yeah, it's interesting. We actually don't address the pandemic in our exhibition. I mean, the pandemic wasn't on the forefront of our mind at that time. And if we redid the exhibition today, I think that lens would have changed. But what I do think about really on a daily basis is how looking at fashion can tell us about the time we're living, right? So looking at fashion between 1914 and 1918 allowed us to understand so much about what women were doing, what they wanted, how the economy was doing, how the political regime was doing, what women were doing for work, how they were working, and also what society thought about women, right? So there was a lot of critique of women and the fact that they were, well, male society was criticizing women for buying fashion, but also criticizing women for not buying fashion because then they were not supporting the economy. So I think about this often, you know, as I sit home and I kind of browse. And on one hand, I feel like, yes, I should be buying and supporting the local economy. And this is something that we saw in very strong message during the First World War: buy local, buy French fashion, because by buying French fashion, you're supporting the economy. And it's an incredible tool to support the economy. So yes, buy. But on the other hand, you know, when you do buy, there's this, you know, the secondary criticism of, oh, you know, you're just being frivolous. You're not thinking of the men on the front lines who are losing their lives. You know, oh, you know, if I buy a dress today, you know, is this frivolity? Should I be putting my money elsewhere? So I think that a lot of the same tension that we see in our relationship to fashion told us a lot about society and about women in the First World War, and can tell us a lot about the times we're living in today. So I mean, I think about this constantly, actually. And it's really interesting. And I also think about, if I were to redo the exhibition today, would I subtly shift ways in which I analyze? I'm not sure, but I think that things have become crisper and clearer. So certain tensions that we saw occurring in the First World War are now like, oh yes, you know, that is a point of tension. And I understand it with more clarity now. What about you, Sophie?
Yes, and you know, there is also this idea that nurses are so important today, and most of people working in the, I don't know in English how we say that, in the EHPAD, you know, where older people are.
Old people's residences.
Yeah, you know, and there are a lot of women taking care of these people, and a lot of nurses in hospitals, lot of women. And you know, also this idea of women's work. And some people say that most people who are really impacted by the situation, maybe on the economic level and social level and on the family level, are the women. And I think it's very interesting, because it was the case during World War I, and the idea that women have to support the economy. And during this pandemic, I think it's very interesting, very important too. And we could also think about fashion as a trend, you know, all this question of mass becoming a fashion statement. And we have this same idea during World War I with the uniforms or the apron that nurses have to wear. It became more or less fashionable to have an apron on the dress. So, you know, we have also this tension between uniform, dress, fashion, and it's not the same today, of course, but we can find some similarities. And I think we can't really analyze that now, but maybe in the following months, we can maybe try to understand how it works today, and if it is the same in 1980.
Yeah.
You know, I was editing this book with Irma with a 1-month-old, 2-month-old baby who would come to Irma's with me. And it was really hard to not have childcare. And this image from the First World War from 1917, do you see it here? Mm-hmm. Of a daycare center in a factory.
Wow.
And I think about this image a lot today. How, as Sophie said, you know, the French economy survived on women's work during the First World War. France right now is also surviving on women's work, nurses, caissières, so women who work in the supermarket.
Cashiers.
The majority of women working. And the issue of childcare and daycare is really at the forefront of everybody's mind, and was during the First World War as well, and still is today. And so, you know, there are touches like this throughout the book. But yeah, I thought that, you know, at the time it was on the forefront of my mind. I thought it was important to end with an image like that, and maybe it's an important image for us to end with today as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. Thank you to you both, Dr. Maude Bass-Krueger and Dr. Sophie Kurkdjian, for your amazing, really important work thinking about women and fashion in the First World War, a huge transformational event globally. We're currently in another globally transformational event, so it's interesting to sort of correlate those both. We will make, for everyone watching, I'll make sure to add links to your publication, the Yale University Press publication, as well as French historical studies, so people have access to them to purchase or to borrow, or however you get your reading. And thank you so much for contributing today. We're so glad to get to know you both.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. I'm so glad to share your work with everyone.